Hey guys, tonight we drift together into a time when the night feels especially long, the fires are dim, and the air is heavy with the kind of silence that makes you wonder if the world itself has forgotten how to sing. You are standing at the crumbling edge of the Roman Empire, and the roads that once pulsed with merchants, soldiers, and gossiping travelers are cracked and lonely. A torch flickers against an old stone archway, and for a heartbeat you imagine the roar of a crowd from centuries past, only to realize the seats are empty, the games are over, and you're late to the after-party by about 300 years. You probably won't survive this, honestly, but don't worry, we're only here in spirit, drifting through the rubble like sleepwalkers. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, tell me where you're tuning in from and what time it is right now. I love seeing the little constellation of sleepy travelers scattered across the map. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge through the dust of an abandoned Roman villa, marble chipped and walls sprayed with vines. Once this place might have echoed with music, with wine poured too freely, with the clatter of sandals across mosaics bright as stained glass. Now it is just you, an owl hooting somewhere overhead, and the faint smell of damp earth rising from cracked tiles. The empire that built this luxury is gone, and you feel its absence like the hollowness after a party when the confetti is swept away. What was once the orderly hum of aqueducts and governors has dissolved into silence broken by the occasional horseman and sometimes by raiders who make even silence seem like a friend. The Dark Ages is what later thinkers called it, a label both unfair and strangely fitting. Historians still argue whether it was truly dark or just dimly lit with flickering candles of knowledge. But for you, wandering these roads, the sense of decline is heavy. Roads that once stretched across continents now crumble, bridges collapse, and in some towns people actually forget how to make roof tiles. Imagine waking up one day and realizing nobody around knows how to replace your ceiling when it leaks. Suddenly, thatched straw feels like cutting-edge technology. You feel the cold bite of change in the air. The legions that once kept bandits at bay have packed up and disappeared, leaving you to squint into forests full of shadows that seem to breathe. In the daylight, villagers mutter about taxes owed not to emperors, but to whichever local warlord can swing a sword the hardest. Justice? It's less about Roman law and more about who has the bigger stick. You shuffle past the husks of once grand amphitheaters where gladiators fought for the crowd, and realize the only combat left is whatever squabble breaks out at the market over a pig. And yet, amid this ruin, life continues. You smell bread baking, simple, coarse but warm enough to keep the belly steady. Children chase each other across fields, though their toys are nothing but sticks and stones. The empire may have collapsed, but people, stubborn as weeds in a garden, keep growing. That's the thing about history. It rarely stops, even when the world feels like it's paused. Still, the contrasts are jarring. You've heard tales of emperors so rich they dyed their robes with snail slime more expensive than gold. Now you watch a farmer in rags patch a roof with mud and straw, shrugging when it collapses again 2 weeks later. A quirky little tidbit floats to mind. Did you know some communities actually reused old Roman amphorae, those tall ceramic wine jars, as burial? Coffins? Recycling? Medieval style? Your feet crunch over broken pottery, and the stars overhead blink coldly. Somewhere far to the north, tribes who once rattled Rome's gates now carve out their own little kingdoms. The Goths, Vandals and Franks, they sound like names of punk rock bands, but here they're the new landlords of history. You can practically hear them carving their graffiti into the marble. Empire was here. The air smells faintly of smoke, and you realize why. Without Rome's endless supply chain of olive oil, lamps burn with whatever grease people can scrape together, sometimes fish oil, sometimes animal fat. It keeps the dark away, but barely. Shadows are deeper now, and so is superstition. You overhear a woman whisper that leaving shoes by the hearth keeps away evil spirits. Who knew footwear could double as medieval home security? Still, fragments of Rome cling on. Latin words slip through the lips of priests. Soldiers wear rusting helmets inherited from grandfathers, and farmers plough fields along lines first drawn by Roman surveyors. You look at these people and see them straddling two worlds, one that was too big to hold, and another still fumbling to be born. In a ruined forum, weeds breaking through marble, you rest for a moment. The silence here isn't complete. Wind whistles through hollow arches, carrying with it echoes of senatorial debates long past. You imagine those debates were just as frustrating as modern office meetings, though with togas instead of ties. The difference is, back then, laws shaped empires. Now you watch as a local chieftain scratches his laws into bark with a knife, and his followers nod as though this is wisdom. Historians still argue whether this was decay or just transformation, but for you, wandering through it, the world feels both familiar and utterly alien. Night falls deeper, fires burn in scattered huts, their smoke rising into the black like tired sighs. Dogs bark at the forest edge, nervous about what might lurk there. You tuck your cloak tighter and feel the weight of this new age pressing down, as though knowledge itself has grown shy, hiding in corners, waiting for the right moment to return. And as you lie back against a fallen column, looking up at stars that Roman astronomers once charted with mathematical precision, you wonder if anyone still remembers their names. Perhaps they do, in some monastery far away, perhaps not. Either way, the sky twinkles, indifferent to empires, and you breathe slow, sinking further into this strange half-lit world. You rise from that ruined forum, brushing dust from your tunic, and wander toward the faint outline of stone arches standing crooked against the dawn. The ruins pull at you, their broken teeth of columns jutting up like a grin from some half-forgotten giant. Once these were libraries, temples of scrolls and codices where scholars debated, copied, and muttered over parchment that smelled faintly of dust and ink. Now they are skeletons of memory, their shelves gnawed away by flame, moisture, and, let's be honest, mice with surprisingly advanced taste in philosophy. You step into the hollow space where a library once stood, your sandals, or whatever passes for shoes in this improvised Dark Ages wardrobe, crunching over rubble. You imagine the glow of lamplight that used to pour across the walls and the hushed scratching of quills, each stroke preserving thoughts across centuries. Those shelves once held Aristotle, Galen, Pliny, names you hear whispered by ghosts tonight, but now ashes mix with bird droppings, and the only voices are pigeons cooing from rafters that are half fallen. You tilt your head and realize the pigeons don't care whether they're roosting on the Republic or the Aeneid. To them, it's all just nesting material. A mainstream historical fact here: when Rome fell, vast swaths of texts were lost, not necessarily because they were burned in one catastrophic blaze, but because papyrus and parchment need caretakers, and caretakers were suddenly scarce. A book without a reader is just tinder, and without trained copyists, even the best works fade faster than you can say, "Oops, spilled wine on Aristotle." Scholars estimate that of the hundreds of thousands of scrolls that once filled Roman libraries, only a tiny fraction made it across the centuries. Imagine binge-watching a series with 20 seasons, then losing everything but 3 random episodes. You look at a charred lump of wood, and your imagination conjures the Library of Alexandria. Ah yes, the legendary blaze. Historians still argue whether Julius Caesar actually torched the whole thing, or whether it was a series of smaller accidents across centuries. Maybe it wasn't even one fire, but neglect, politics, and the occasional careless smoker. Either way, Alexandria has become the world's favorite historical oops. And as you lean against a crumbling arch, you realize that for the people living here in these so-called Dark Ages, the loss wasn't a distant myth, it was their reality. Still, not all was lost. You picture a hooded monk hauling a few precious codices in a sack, trudging toward a monastery perched on some windswept hill. Knowledge didn't vanish completely, it slipped into hiding, like a shy animal curling up in a burrow. Those monks saved texts by copying them, line by painstaking line, often adding doodles of rabbits in the margins because, hey, even scribes get bored. One quirky tidbit: some medieval manuscripts have random little cartoons drawn by monks, like knights fighting snails. Historians still debate why snails of all creatures became a recurring nemesis. Maybe the monks just thought slow battles were funny. You imagine yourself in one of those monasteries, hunched under candlelight, the wax dripping perilously close to your manuscript. The air is thick with smoke, the scratching of quills fills your ears, and the faint smell of sheepskin parchment reminds you that, yes, some unlucky sheep gave its hide so Aristotle could survive. You might nod off mid-copy, your quill dragging an unplanned line across the page, and then, boom, you've just invented avant-garde medieval art. Meanwhile, outside the monastery walls, knowledge is less about scrolls and more about memory. Bards and storytellers wander from village to village, repeating sagas and tales until they're worn smooth like pebbles. Oral tradition becomes the Netflix of the era, though with fewer dragons per minute than audiences probably wanted. You sit by a smoky hearth one night and listen to an old man retell a Roman legend, except in this version, Hercules moonlights as a farmer, and somehow there's a chicken that lays gold coins. Details get fuzzy in the dark. But as you listen, you realize something important. Forgetting isn't always total. Sometimes it's selective. People forget the formulas for concrete strong enough to last centuries, yet they remember recipes for beer. Priorities, right? You taste the earthy, slightly sour brew, and you're not sure if that's history on your tongue or just badly fermented barley. Either way, it goes down warm. As you stumble back toward the ruins, your thoughts return to those lost libraries. Imagine how many answers slipped away. Did someone already figure out germs centuries before microscopes? Did some genius have the blueprint for steam engines tucked in a scroll that fed goats in a barn? Historians still argue whether technological leaps are inevitable or whether humanity hit pause simply because those pages were turned to mulch. The air grows cooler, and you find yourself in another hall of ruins. A mosaic floor stretches before you, cracked but still glittering, a reminder that beauty can outlast memory. You trace the outline of a tessera with your toe and realize knowledge isn't always words. It can be pictures, patterns, even the memory of a song hummed by peasants who have no clue they're preserving fragments of an ancient melody. You hum along, off-key, because even in the Dark Ages, karaoke finds a way. Above, the stars are sharp pinpricks, bright enough to make you squint. Roman astronomers once charted them with surprising precision. Now villagers might only know them as the hunter, the plough, or those three shiny dots. You lean back, neck aching, and think about how memory shrinks and expands like lungs breathing in and out. Knowledge isn't gone, it just sometimes hides behind simpler names. And in that moment, as wind sighs through the ruins, you wonder if forgetting is always a tragedy. Maybe some things need to be forgotten so new things can grow. Or maybe that's just you, rationalizing while your stomach growls. Either way, you pull your cloak tighter and shuffle forward, deeper into this half-remembered world, chasing the ghosts of wisdom across broken marble floors. You shuffle out of the echoing ruins, the dawn mist clinging to your hair, and follow the faint toll of a bell. Its sound is slow, steady, like a heartbeat cutting through the fog. Your path winds up a narrow track, and soon you see it. A squat stone monastery perched on the hilltop, walls weathered, roof patched, but still standing strong against the pull of time. The gate creaks as you step through, and suddenly the world outside, the bandits, the burned libraries, the collapsing roads, feels like a different universe. Inside, there is only the hush of whispers, the scratch of quills, and the faint smell of beeswax candles. A monk passes you, his hood shadowing his face, his sandals silent on the cold floor. You trail him down a dim corridor lined with alcoves. At the end, the light opens into a scriptorium, a room thick with concentration. Monks bend over wooden desks, quills poised like daggers over parchment, their lips moving as they sound out each word before copying it. You realize you are watching the slow lifeline of civilization being drawn one careful letter at a time. Without these men, whole centuries of thought would vanish, dissolved like ink in rain. Mainstream fact: monasteries during the so-called Dark Ages became the last havens of classical knowledge. From around the 6th century onward, monks in Ireland, Italy and beyond devoted their lives to copying manuscripts. Some worked on the Bible, yes, but others preserved Aristotle, Virgil, Cicero, authors who had nothing to do with saints but everything to do with the foundation of Western thought. You lean closer and see that one monk has scrawled a little note in the margin. The day is cold, the work is long, my hand is weary. Even then, burnout was real. You notice something odd on another page, a doodle, a tiny rabbit leaping across the margin. Then another page shows a fish, then a dragon, then a bell tolls again, and the monks set down their quills, rising as one. You follow them into the chapel where chants swell into the air, voices layering like mist on water. You sit in the back, feeling the vibration of Latin prayers you don't quite understand but find oddly soothing, like an ancient ASMR session. The candles flicker, shadows dance across the stone, and you realize that in a world unraveling outside, this chant is a thread holding things together. After the service, the monks file back to their tasks, some to gardens, some to kitchens, some back to the scriptorium. You wander into the kitchen where the smell of lentil stew hangs heavy. A brother stirs the pot and smiles at you, offering a bowl. You take a bite and immediately your tongue tells you what your brain suspected. It's bland. Quirky fact: many monasteries had rules against using too much seasoning. Spices were worldly, and the monks' vow of poverty apparently extended to their taste buds. Still, you chew dutifully, because even bad stew is better than no stew in the Dark Ages. As night creeps in, you sit with one of the older monks by the fire. His eyes are pale blue, his beard streaked with white, and his voice is a slow rumble. He tells you how the monastery received a shipment of books from a fallen Roman town, and how some were too damaged to save. Others, though, survived, wrapped in oilskins, hidden in barns, smuggled like treasure. He holds up a tattered manuscript and sighs. This, he says, is Cicero. I do not know if the world will need him again, but I copy because perhaps it will. You imagine the monk's hands trembling as he works, not just from age but from weight, the weight of knowing that if he falters, an entire voice from history could vanish forever. You take a sip of thin ale and feel the truth of it sink in. These monks weren't just scribes, they were lifeboats, raying fragments of civilization across a sea of forgetting. Later, as you curl on a straw mattress in a narrow guest cell, you hear the chanting again, faint through the stone walls. Outside, the wind rattles the shutters, but inside, knowledge is alive, breathing quietly on parchment. You smile at the absurdity that the survival of Aristotle, Virgil, and half the stuff you snoozed through in school depended on sleep-deprived monks, doodling rabbits in the margins, and with that thought you drift into dreams filled with ink-stained fingers and pig-shaped doodles dancing under candlelight. You wake in that narrow monastic cell, the straw still itchy against your cheek, and shuffle back down the path into the wider world. The air smells faintly of smoke and damp leaves, and before long you find yourself drifting into a clearing where villagers have gathered around a rough-hewn wooden cross. Some kneel, some mutter prayers, and just beyond them, a woman ties a ribbon to a tree while whispering to the bark. You tilt your head, because here is the collision. The new faith of Christianity pressing itself onto the land, and the old ways clinging stubbornly like ivy on stone. The priest in a worn robe raises his hands, chanting in Latin, his words thick and formal. Yet, at the edge of the circle, an old man tosses salt into the fire and mutters in his native tongue, invoking some half-remembered forest god. Historians still argue whether this period should be seen as the conversion of Europe or as a long, messy negotiation between two overlapping belief systems. To you, standing here in the smoke and candlelight, it looks less like one religion replacing another and more like a strange fusion buffet. Mainstream fact: in the early medieval centuries, Christianity spread rapidly across Europe, but often the old practices never truly disappeared. Instead, they were rebranded. Festivals dedicated to pagan gods were recast as saints' days. Holy wells once tied to water spirits were rededicated to the Virgin Mary, and stone circles became places of pilgrimage. You notice how this cross is planted right next to a grove that villagers clearly still treat as sacred. Two traditions sit side by side, glaring at each other but unwilling to move out. As you drift closer, a young woman slips a sprig of herbs into the folds of her cloak. She's muttering something about protection against the evil eye. The priest doesn't see, or maybe he pretends not to. Quirky tidbits. Even centuries after official Christianization, people across Europe still believed in charms, amulets, and spells. Archaeologists have dug up little lead tablets inscribed with curses, requests for divine revenge against a cheating lover or a dishonest neighbor. So much for turning the other cheek. You wander past the crowd and into the woods, where the scent of pine wraps around you like a blanket. A small group sits in a clearing, whispering stories of spirits who guard rivers and stones that bleed if struck with iron. One man pulls a carved wooden idol from his pouch, tiny, weathered, its face crude but clearly cared for. He tucks it away quickly when he hears distant bells, as if hiding contraband candy from a teacher. You chuckle softly because even in the Dark Ages humans are experts at hedging bets. Pray to the new god on Sunday, whisper to the old gods on Monday, just in case. The blending can be surreal. In some villages people carried crucifixes while also leaving offerings of milk for fairies. Historians still argue whether these practices should be called superstition or just everyday spirituality. But from your perspective, sitting cross-legged on a log while villagers tell stories by firelight, it feels more like humanity's refusal to give up comfort rituals. If rubbing garlic on your doorframe keeps away both demons and vampires, why not? Worst case, you just have a really pungent doorway. The wind picks up, rattling branches overhead, and someone tells a tale of saints who once were warriors. You realize many saints' stories were adapted from old heroic legends. That dragon St. George supposedly slew, very suspiciously similar to the monsters defeated by pagan heroes. You sip from a shared flask of ale and think, so basically they just rebranded Hercules as a saint with better PR. You picture a medieval marketing meeting. Okay team, we've got a hero, a sword and a monster. Let's slap a halo on him and call it divine. The fire pops, sparks spiraling into the night. You close your eyes and feel the overlapping currents of faith humming in the dark. One moment it's the stern chant of Latin prayers. The next, it's a whispered charm against toothache involving wolf bones and honey. Quirky? Absolutely. Effective? Well, historians still argue about that too. Later, you return to the village and find yourself in a small hut with smoke curling through a hole in the roof. A healer kneels beside a child, pressing herbs into a cloth bundle while murmuring both a Christian blessing and a forest charm. You realize she's blending remedies like a DJ mixing tracks, half saint, half spirit, all hope. The child groans, the mother crosses herself, and you feel the fragile line between superstition and science wobble like a tightrope. Outside again you notice how the church bell tolls with authority. Yet villagers still glance nervously toward the woods at night. Faith doesn't erase fear, it just gives it a new vocabulary. One man tells you he saw lights dancing in the marsh last night, spirits luring wanderers to drown. Another insists it was just will-o'-the-wisps, gas flames from rotting plants. The debate grows heated, but no one volunteers to test it by wandering into the marsh after dark. As you settle on the edge of the village, staring into the stars, you realize that belief here is not about certainty, it's about survival. People need their saints and their charms, their prayers and their idols because life is fragile, and explanations, any explanations, are better than none. You pull your cloak tighter and think maybe it doesn't matter which story is true as long as it lets you sleep at night under a sky full of unknowns. The bell tolls again. The priest preaches, the villagers whisper, and the forest waits, older than both. And you, caught between, drift on the boundary where faiths collide, neither fully forgotten nor fully new. You shuffle onward from that village caught between saints and spirits, your feet dragging through damp grass until the smell of smoke and something less pleasant reaches your nose. The hut you approach is small, its roof sagging, its walls patched with mud. Inside, a man lies pale and trembling on a straw pallet. His family crowds around him, whispering prayers, offering sips of cloudy water. You step closer and notice the healer at his side, a woman with a bundle of herbs hanging from her belt and a look in her eye that's half confidence, half guesswork. She grinds leaves into a paste, smearing it on the man's chest. The smell of garlic and bitter roots fills the room and you suppress a cough. Mainstream historical fact: much of medieval medicine was based on herbal remedies inherited from Roman and even earlier traditions. Plants like sage, fennel, and garlic were prescribed for everything from stomach aches to warding off evil. Sometimes they worked. Garlic does have antibacterial properties. Sometimes, well, you basically just smelled like soup while you died. You glance at the healer's table and notice something squirming. Leeches. Yes, those squishy little vampires in a bowl of water, waiting for their turn to shine. Quirky tidbit. Bloodletting was considered one of the most important treatments in the Middle Ages, based on the belief that balancing the body's four humours, blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, would restore health. You wince as one is pressed to the man's arm, its slimy body wriggling as it latches on. You mutter to yourself that medieval health insurance must have included a complimentary jar of leeches. The patient groans, the leech fattens, and the healer nods with satisfaction. Historians still argue whether this reliance on humoral theory helped or hindered progress. On one hand, it gave doctors a framework to think systematically. But not all of it is horror. Some remedies worked astonishingly well. Honey, for instance, was used to dress wounds, and surprise, it has natural antibacterial properties, meaning it actually helped. Wine was poured into cuts to clean them, which stung like medieval fire but did kill germs. Even the humble onion was part of treatments for eye infections, so not everything was nonsense. Sometimes medieval healers stumbled onto truth centuries before microscopes could explain why. You sit by a well, splashing cool water on your face, and overhear two men debating the cause of sickness. One insists it's punishment from God, another blames bad air rising from swamps. A third swears he saw a witch walking past just before the fever started. Historians still argue about how widespread belief in witchcraft as a medical explanation was during these centuries. But to the villagers, the connection seems obvious. Strange old woman plus sudden illness equal guilty. You sigh, realizing you're in a world where correlation always equals causation. Night deepens, and you're invited into another hut where a childbirth is underway. The air is hot, damp, filled with cries. Women gather, guiding the mother through the pain, whispering prayers, tying charms to the bedposts. One midwife sprinkles salt in the corners to keep away demons. Another grips the woman's hand with practiced calm, and when the baby finally wails into the night, the entire room exhales in relief. A healthy child, a mother alive, against the odds. You marvel at the resilience, the way life persists even with little more than herbs, charms, and hope. Later, lying under a rough wool blanket, you think about how fragile bodies are in this world. A simple cut can kill, a fever can sweep through a village, and childbirth is a gamble. And yet you also think about the human ingenuity that surfaces again and again, people using hoe, nay, wine, herbs, prayers, all tools within reach to fight back against the darkness. You smile faintly despite the smell of garlic still clinging to your cloak, and drift into uneasy dreams of leeches and laughing monks doodling snails in margins. You leave the smoky huts and the herb-scented remedies behind, following the winding dirt road deeper into the heart of this shadowed age. Your steps echo faintly in the crisp morning air, the world around you quieter than you remember. The fields give way to small settlements, wooden palisades leaning like tired old men, and within them you find a new sort of figure emerging. The scholar. Not the kind you picture today with laptops and lecture halls, but men and women in rough wool wandering between courts, monasteries and taverns, carrying little more than a satchel of parchment and a head full of questions. You follow one such figure, a wiry man with ink-stained fingers and an absent look in his eyes. He's muttering to himself, but instead of prayers or charms, he's repeating bits of Aristotle in broken Latin, puzzling over what it means. He sets down his bundle of scrolls on a rickety table inside a dim alehouse, orders a mug of mead, and immediately launches into an impromptu lecture to whoever will listen. You sit nearby, cradling your own drink, pretending to be just another weary traveller, but secretly eavesdropping on the debate unfolding like a medieval talk show. Mainstream historical fact. During the so-called Dark Ages, learning didn't vanish entirely, it shifted. Many scholars fled to monasteries where they had the resources to copy and preserve texts, but there were also secular thinkers who moved from court to court, offering their knowledge in exchange for food, lodging, or protection. They studied the few surviving works of antiquity, often without access to the full context. Imagine trying to understand a complicated TV series by only seeing one random episode in the middle. You'd probably come up with some wild theories, and wild theories they had. The scholar in front of you is explaining Aristotle's idea of spontaneous generation, the belief that life can spring up from non-life. According to this theory, maggots just appear in rotting meat, frogs form out of mud, and mice. Apparently, if you leave a pile of sweaty clothes in the corner with some wheat, voila, you get mice. Quirky tidbit, some medieval manuals actually gave recipes for creating mice this way, like some kind of horrible Martha Stewart segment. Step 1, leave your dirty laundry in the corner. Step 2, wait a week. Step 3, surprise, it's a family of rodents. You're suddenly grateful that your modern laundry just leaves you with unmatched socks. As the scholar drones on, you notice a group of listeners shifting nervously. Some nod along, others whisper doubts. One man insists that sickness comes from demons, not from bad air or unbalanced humors. Another says the earth is flat, an old claim that modern myth sometimes exaggerates. Historians still argue whether most medieval people actually believed in a flat earth. Evidence suggests many educated folks knew the world was round, even if they weren't exactly drawing accurate globes yet. You sip your mead and try not to laugh when the tavern owner declares that the world rests on the back of a giant fish. Everyone nods politely because disagreeing with the guy who pours your drink is never wise. Later, you follow the scholar out of the tavern and down a narrow path lined with torches. He leads a group of eager listeners into a barn where they huddle in the straw, debating theology, astronomy, and whether or not cats are secretly spies for witches. This kind of clandestine study session was more common than you'd think. Knowledge here isn't celebrated, it's suspicious. Question too loudly, and you might be branded a heretic. And being a heretic in this time isn't like getting banned from a social media platform. It's more like, well, you probably don't want to know before bed. You sit quietly as the scholar pulls out a crumbling manuscript. He reads from it, stumbling over words he doesn't quite understand. The language is old, and whole sections are missing, gnawed away by mice, perhaps the ones born of dirty laundry. The gaps leave space for imagination, and the listeners fill them eagerly with their own ideas. One insists the missing line must have been a prophecy about their village. Another thinks it was a recipe for beer. You smile softly, realizing that forgetting doesn't always mean emptiness. It can also mean invention. In a corner, a young boy sketches shapes in the dirt with a stick. Circles, triangles, stars. He looks up at you with wide eyes and whispers, "Do you know the secret names of the stars?" You shake your head, though you could recite constellations in your sleep. But here in this moment it feels wrong to interrupt his wonder. You watch him draw Orion as 3 dots in a row, then add what looks suspiciously like a smiley face. The past may be fragile, but curiosity seems impossible to crush. You spend the evening listening to their arguments, lulled by the rhythm of their voices. Some ideas sound strange, like the notion that earthquakes are caused by giant underground beasts rolling over in their sleep. Others sound surprisingly familiar, like the careful observation of the heavens to predict the seasons, a science you know will one day guide sailors across oceans. Historians still argue whether medieval scholars were truly stuck in the dark or just climbing a different ladder toward understanding. From your quiet spot in the barn, you feel it's a bit of both. They are clinging to fragments of old wisdom, yet from those fragments, something new is starting to form. When the debate winds down, the group drifts back into the night, leaving behind the smell of smoke and the echo of arguments about angels dancing on in heads. Though you suspect no one has ever actually counted, you wrap your cloak tighter, smile at the absurdity, and lie back among the straw. The rafters above creak in the wind, and you close your eyes, hearing the muffled laughter of monks doodling snails and the whispered charms of villagers in the dark. The world may have forgotten some things, but it never stops whispering, never stops inventing, never stops trying to make sense of the shadows. You drift away from the quiet of the monastery and the smoke of village fires, following a sound you can't quite place. At first it seems like a low rumble of thunder, but the sky is clear. The noise grows louder, more rhythmic, until it resolves into the pounding of oars against water. You crest a hill and see them, long wooden ships sliding silently up a misty river, their dragon-headed prows cutting through the current as if the water itself is making way. The sails, striped in blood red and white, billow in the morning wind. These are the longships of the Norsemen, and you suddenly wish you had taken a different path. The villagers know what this means. Doors slam shut, livestock scatter, and you can hear the frantic hammering of someone trying to barricade their home with whatever planks they can find. A child drops a bucket and it rolls into the mud, forgotten. You stand frozen, half wanting to run, half mesmerized by the beauty of the ships as they glide to the shore. The warriors leap out with axes glinting in the early light, their shouts echoing through the valley. It's terrifying, yes, but also strangely cinematic, like watching a movie scene, except you're standing in the splash zone. You probably won't survive this one either, but hey, it makes for a gripping bedtime story. A mainstream historical fact, Viking raids began in the late 8th century, with the infamous 793 CE attack on the monastery at Lindisfarne, off the coast of England. It was so shocking that a chronicler at the time described it as a sign of the apocalypse. From then on, Norse raiders became a constant presence along the coasts and rivers of Europe, sailing as far as Spain, Italy, and even into the Byzantine Empire. Their longships, shallow enough to glide up rivers yet sturdy enough to cross oceans, made them nearly unstoppable. But the Vikings weren't just marauders. You find this firsthand when you creep closer to their camp. Some warriors are indeed sharpening axes and boasting about how many monasteries they've plundered, yet others are trading amber, furs, and silver coins. You spot one proudly offering a comb carved from reindeer antler. Quirky tidbit: Vikings were surprisingly obsessed with grooming. Archaeologists often find combs, tweezers, and even ear spoons in Viking graves. So yes, these terrifying raiders paused between battles to make sure their beards looked sharp, something to remember the next time you hesitate to pluck your eyebrows. As the warriors feast, they pass around bowls of mead, laughing loudly and singing songs in booming voices. You catch phrases about Odin, about Valhalla, about heroes whose deeds echo through eternity. But then you notice something curious. One of the younger men raises his drink not to Thor or Odin, but to the White Christ. Historians still argue about how sincere Viking conversions to Christianity really were. Some kings accepted baptism for political reasons, only to keep sacrificing to the old gods on the side. You picture a Viking warlord telling a priest, "Yes, yes, I believe in your God. Now excuse me, I've got a goat sacrifice to attend." The night grows raucous. Bonfires flare, casting shadows that look like writhing monsters on the trees. The warriors slam their fists against their shields in rhythm with their chants, a hypnotic beat that vibrates in your chest. You almost feel yourself nodding along as though you've been drafted into their warband without signing up. Someone offers you a roasted fish, charred, smoky, and just a little undercooked. You chew politely, even as your stomach wonders whether this meal will come back to haunt you at 3 a.m. At the edge of the firelight, a skald, a Viking poet, begins to tell a saga. His voice is rough but steady, and he recounts voyages across endless seas, battles with sea monsters, and encounters with lands so strange they might as well be other planets. You realize that while Roman libraries turned to dust, the Vikings wrote history in verse, in memory, in songs carried across the waves. It wasn't the careful copying of monks, it was living, breathing storytelling. And like all good bedtime stories, parts of of it were definitely exaggerated. You know that because, according to him, one of his ancestors wrestled a walrus the size of a mountain. Sure, Jan. You step away from the fire as the night deepens, following the riverbank. The longships bob gently in the water, their dragon heads staring down at you with wooden eyes. You can almost imagine them alive, their carved mouths opening to breathe fire. The world feels balanced between myth and reality, and you wonder whether the people around you even cared about the difference. Maybe when every season brought famine or raids, a good story was just as important as clean water. Historians still argue whether the Viking invasions truly plunged Europe deeper into darkness, or whether they inadvertently spread knowledge by opening new trade routes and mingling cultures. As you gaze out over the river, you can almost see both sides. Yes, the villages are burning, but you also see foreign coins glittering in the firelight, strange spices spilling from sacks, and even a silk banner fluttering in the breeze. For every monastery looted, there's a new connection made between worlds that would one day form the foundation of something larger. The fire behind you roars louder, someone is singing off-key, and another man is juggling fish heads. You smirk. It seems every age has its party trick, though this one might not go viral on TikTok anytime soon. You decide it's time to move on before someone hands you a shield and points you toward the nearest monastery. The river calls you onward, its dark water reflecting the stars above. The dragon heads fade into the mist, their eyes glowing faintly until they vanish completely. The night presses close again, quieter now, as though the world itself is catching its breath after the storm of laughter and steel. You follow the winding path away from the campfires, your steps slower, your eyelids heavier, carrying with you the memory of chanting warriors and carefully combed beards, of knowledge shouted in taverns and scribbled in secret by monks. The Dark Ages may be remembered as a time of forgetting, but as you drift into the soft rustle of trees and the low hum of insects, you realize something else. Even in the shadows, people never stopped seeking meaning. Whether with ink, herbs, or dragon-headed ships, they kept trying to write themselves into the world. And as you yawn, pulling your cloak tight against the chill, you know that tomorrow you'll stumble into yet another corner of this half-lit age, and the whispers of lost knowledge will follow you still. The village you leave behind fades into the distance, its smoke curling lazily into the sky like a final exhale after a long day. The path ahead cuts through thick mud, sucking at your feet with every step. The sun is low now, and the world is painted in a bronze haze, the kind that makes even the most ordinary things, broken fences, crooked trees, scattered stones, look like relics of some forgotten age. You follow the sound of wooden wheels grinding against dirt, and soon you come upon a field where peasants bend low over the soil, their backs arched like bows strung too tightly. The earth here is stubborn. It clings to the wooden plows as though it doesn't want to be turned, and you can almost hear the grunts of oxen straining against the yoke. The farmer guiding them looks over his shoulder at you with a face burned by the sun and lined by worry. His hands are cracked, his tunic patched more times than you can count, and yet there's a rhythm in the way he guides the blade, a patient persistence that reminds you of the monks scratching away in their scriptorium. Different tools, same determination. Mainstream historical fact, agriculture in the early medieval period was backbreaking work, and most peasants lived at the edge of survival. The heavy plough was a game-changer in Northern Europe, allowing farmers to dig deep into heavy clay soils that had previously been almost impossible to cultivate. Before this innovation spread, much of that land was practically useless. With it, villages expanded, fields grew, and harvests became slightly more reliable. Slightly, but not always. You crouch down and pick up a clump of earth, smelling the wet clay and feeling its weight. The farmer explains, in a dialect that's half Latin, half something older, that the soil here can be generous one year and stingy the next. He shrugs when you ask about fertilizer. We use what we have. He says, pointing to the dung heap steaming behind the hut. Quirky tidbit, animal dung wasn't just fertilizer, it was also used for insulation, fuel, and sometimes even as building material. Medieval life was sustainable, sure, but it definitely wasn't glamorous. You think to yourself, imagine inviting guests over and bragging about your new eco-friendly cowpat walls. Nearby, women are gathering herbs and berries, their hands quick, their laughter carrying across the field. They weave wildflowers into their hair, partly for beauty, partly because they believe certain flowers protect them from illness. A child runs up holding a frog, announcing proudly that it will cure warts if rubbed the right way. You smile, trying not to think about how many frogs have been unwilling dermatologists in history. At the edge of the field, a small group of peasants sit hunched over a wooden table counting out coins. You notice they aren't gold or silver, but strange stamped discs of bronze and tin. Mainstream fact: after the Roman economy collapsed, coinage often became rare and bartering made a comeback. Payment might come in chickens, grain, or even beer instead of money. In some places, people cut coins into pieces to make smaller change, which makes sense but also means shopping could turn into a very sharp and finger-threatening activity. You lean on a fence post, listening to the peasants debate whether to sell their grain to a passing merchant or keep it for winter. The merchant, a man with a heavy beard and suspiciously shiny boots, offers salt in exchange. Salt is precious here, more valuable than gold at times because it preserves meat through the long winters. Historians still argue whether medieval people were perpetually on the brink of famine, or whether that's just a myth fueled by chroniclers who loved to dramatize shortages. Still, as you watch a child chew on a crust of bread so hard it could double as a weapon, you're inclined to think famine was more fact than fiction. The day stretches on. The peasants bent under their labors. You try helping for a while, gripping a hoe and dragging it through the earth, but within minutes your back is protesting, your hands blistering. One old woman laughs at your feeble attempt and pats your shoulder, handing you a wooden cup of weak beer. "Better leave this to us," she says, shaking her head. You grin sheepishly and take another sip, wondering if maybe the Dark Ages really were darker for the people doing all the digging. As dusk falls, you join the villagers in a communal hall, little more than a smoky barn filled with benches and the smell of turnip stew. The fire crackles, shadows dancing on the low ceiling, and the people relax into their rough-hewn cups and bread. Someone plays a fiddle-like instrument, the notes high and reedy, while children spin in uneven circles. For a moment, the world doesn't feel so dark. There is laughter, music, the simple comfort of food after labor. And then, just as you start to think maybe this isn't so bad, someone stands up to complain about taxes. Quirky fact: in many parts of medieval Europe, peasants paid taxes not just in money or goods, but in bizarre offerings. In one region, people were required to give eels to their local lord, sometimes hundreds of them. Imagine trying to explain to your neighbor that your rent this month is 30 eels. You chuckle softly, picturing medieval landlords complaining, "Sorry, rent's late, no eel, no deal." But beneath the laughter and the faint music, there's a heaviness in the hall. People talk about hunger, about wolves creeping closer to the village, about children lost to fevers. One man mutters that maybe the old gods are angry. Another says the Christian priest promised heaven if they endured suffering. You sit quietly, realizing that this is the essence of the so-called Dark Ages, not total ignorance but a conscious negotiation with forces seen and unseen, real and imagined. Historians still argue whether peasants in this era were truly as downtrodden as we imagine, or whether our view has been colored by later writers with their own agendas. Some evidence shows that peasant life was brutal, short, and uncertain. Other sources hint at festivals, songs, and small joys that made survival not just possible but meaningful. As you watch a boy laugh with his mouth full of bread, you wonder if he'll remember this moment years from now, or if it will vanish like the ashes of Rome's libraries. The fire in the hall burns lower, and the villagers drift into snores and murmurs. You curl up on a bench, the hard wood pressing into your side, the air thick with smoke and stew. Outside, the wind moans through the trees again, carrying with it the whisper of old gods who refuse to be forgotten. You close your eyes, lulled by the creak of timbers, the drone of a fiddle, and the steady rhythm of a world rebuilding itself from ruins, one muddy furrow and one bowl of turnip soup at a time. Morning mist still clings to your cloak as you leave the fields behind. The sound of the villagers fades, replaced by the steady thud of hammers in the distance. You follow the echo, and soon the landscape changes. Where there were once sagging huts and tilled earth, now massive stone walls rise out of the hills like the bones of some great beast. You squint up at towers that seem to scrape the clouds, their banners snapping in the wind. You've stumbled into the age of castles, and suddenly mud huts feel very far away. The first thing you notice is how cold everything looks. The walls are grey, the towers severe, the gates built not to welcome but to keep out. As you shuffle closer, the drawbridge creaks and lowers. A guard eyes you with suspicion, spear in hand, until he sees your tired face and decides you're no threat. You cross the moat, water green and sluggish, with ducks gliding across as if it's their personal luxury resort, and step into the courtyard. Inside, the castle is buzzing like a beehive. Blacksmiths hammer at glowing iron, sparks flying like fireflies. Children chase chickens across the cobblestones, giggling until they trip. A dog barks at you, then realizes you're too sleepy to chase and trots away in boredom. Somewhere overhead, a flag snaps loudly in the morning wind, the emblem of the local lord painted in bright colors that seem to have been chosen by someone with questionable taste. Mainstream historical fact: castles in the early Middle Ages weren't just about luxury, they were defensive fortresses. After the fall of Rome, constant raids from Vikings, Magyars, and other groups made protection a priority. Stone castles, often surrounded by moats or perched on hills, became symbols of power as well as safety. They were expensive to build, and usually only nobles or kings could afford them, which meant peasants often lived in their shadow, both literally and socially. You climb a spiral staircase that seems to go on forever, your hand sliding along a cold stone wall. By the time you reach the top, your thighs are burning, and you think about how medieval guards must have had very toned calves from all this climbing. At the top, the view takes your breath away. Fields stretch in patchwork squares, forests huddle in the distance, and the village you just left looks like a tiny smudge of rooftops. From up here, the world seems both wide and fragile. Inside the great hall, the air is warmer. Tapestries hang on the walls, woven with colourful scenes of battles and saints. Long wooden tables are stacked with trenchers, thick slabs of stale bread used as plates, and pitchers of watered wine. The lord sits at the head of the table, wearing a heavy fur cloak that probably smells faintly of wet dog. He tears into a roast goose with his bare hands, grease shining on his chin, while a bard strums a harp nearby. You take a seat at the edge of the table, next to a servant carrying a platter of something that looks suspiciously like a pie filled with eels. Quirky tidbit. Medieval feasts loved unusual dishes, not just for flavor, but for spectacle. Sometimes pies were baked with live birds inside, so when the crust was cut open they'd fly out. It was less of a meal and more of a medieval magic trick. You silently hope no one tries that with your dinner, unless you're allowed to Instagram it, of course. The chatter in the hall rises and falls like waves. A knight brags about the new fortifications on the castle walls, boasting that no raider could possibly breach them. Another scoffs, saying he's heard stories of Vikings hauling their ships across land to bypass rivers and appear where no one expected. Historians still argue how effective castles really were at keeping enemies out. Some say they created safe havens that allowed Europe to stabilize. Others argue that they simply shifted the violence, turning open raids into long sieges where everyone inside slowly starved. You sip from your cup and the thin wine tastes more like sour grapes than comfort. As the feast goes on, a jester in brightly coloured rags tumbles into the hall, bells jingling from his cap. He juggles apples, drops one, and without missing a beat, picks it up and eats it, juice running down his chin. The crowd roars with laughter, relieved for a moment to forget famine, war, and taxes. You can't help but grin too. Even in the darkest centuries, humour slips in like a candle under a door. Later, when the feast has wound down and the hall is littered with bones and stale crusts, you slip outside. The night air is biting, but fresh compared to the smoky warmth inside. You walk past the stables where horses shift and snort in their stalls, their breath clouds in the air, mingling with the scent of hay. A stable boy snores loudly in the corner, his head resting against a post, straw tangled in his hair like a crown. You resist the urge to place a chicken feather in his hand, imagining the confusion when he wakes up. The moon rises high, casting silver light across the stone walls of the castle. From this vantage point, the moat gleams like black glass, the towers standing like silent sentinels. You lean against the cold stone and realize that while these castles look eternal, they too will one day crumble like the Roman ruins you passed earlier. Historians still argue whether castles were truly practical defenses or just massive displays of wealth and power. You suspect they were both, fortresses against the world and monuments to the ego of the lords who built them. The night grows quieter. You lie on the grass at the base of the wall, listening to the distant hoot of an owl and the faint laughter still drifting from the hall. You close your eyes and the world blurs into a haze of stone, firelight and music. Somewhere in the back of your mind you can almost hear the whisper of a monk's quill scratching across parchment, the echo of a Viking's chant, the laughter of peasants around a smoky hearth. You smile softly, realizing that even in these cold castles, knowledge, like warmth, was never truly gone, only hidden behind thick walls and thicker beards. The castle fades behind you, its banners drooping in the dawn mist, and your feet carry you down a winding road where the air is thick with incense and expectation. Ahead, a crowd gathers around a small chapel, their faces upturned with reverence, their hands clutching wooden rosaries or clumps of wildflowers. You slip into the throng, drawn by the energy. A bell tolls, heavy and slow, and out of the chapel door comes a priest bearing a box of treasures. The villagers gasp. They're not just here for prayer, they've come to touch the sacred. The relic is unveiled, a bone, yellowed with age, wrapped in silk and set in a gold frame studded with glass gems that sparkle in the light. A woman bursts into tears at the sight, clutching her child closer. A man bows so low his forehead touches the dirt. The priest proclaims it a finger of St. James, though you notice it looks suspiciously like it might have once belonged to a goat. Quirky tidbit, the trade in relics during the Middle Ages was so intense that many churches claimed to own body parts of saints, sometimes multiples of the same body part. At one point there were enough pieces of the true cross scattered around Europe to build a decent-sized ship. You edge closer, your cloak brushing against other pilgrims who smell of sweat, dust, and excitement. Some have traveled weeks, even months, just to touch this relic. Mainstream fact. Pilgrimages became a central part of medieval spirituality. From Santiago de Compostela in Spain to Canterbury in England, people trudged across entire countries seeking healing, forgiveness, or simply the thrill of being near something holy. For many, it was the one journey of their lives, equal parts devotion and adventure. The line moves forward, and you step inside the chapel. The air is thick with incense, so heavy it clings to your lungs. Candles flicker against the walls, their weight on, X dripping in frozen rivers down to the stone floor. You kneel with the others, though your knees complain against the hard ground, and watch as each pilgrim presses lips or fingers to the relic. A blind man is led forward, his hands trembling as they touch the box. The crowd holds its breath. He blinks once, twice, and sighs. Still blind, yet he smiles as though the mere touch was enough to heal something inside. Outside, the pilgrims mingle in the courtyard. Some trade stories of visions they've seen, while others hawk souvenirs, little badges stamped with saints' faces or bottles of water allegedly drawn from holy springs. You can't help but think of a medieval gift shop, complete with overpriced trinkets. Historians still argue whether relics were genuine articles of faith or just a medieval tourist industry. Either way, the people here believe, and belief has a power of its own. As the day stretches, you fall in with a group of pilgrims heading toward a larger shrine further along the road. They chatter about miracles, a lame woman who walked again, a storm calmed by prayer, a child cured of fever after touching a saint's shroud. You march beside them, your boots sucking in and out of mud, and feel the strange unity of walking together for a common goal. Even if the relics are questionable, the sense of belonging is real. At night you rest at a roadside inn overflowing with travelers. The air is thick with laughter, snores, and the occasional sneeze. A minstrel strums a lute, singing about St. George slaying his dragon, and the crowd joins in on the chorus. You sip thin ale and notice a man at the next table trying to sell a holy feather from the Archangel Gabriel's wing. The feather is clearly from a goose, but the crowd doesn't seem to mind. You smirk, whispering to yourself, medieval eBay is alive and well. The next morning you trudge into a bustling town square. Merchants shout about relics for sale: a vial of Mary Magdalene's tears, a tooth of John the Baptist, a nail from the crucifixion. You roll your eyes when you see 3 different stalls selling the skull of St. Peter. Either Peter had 3 heads, or someone's scamming. Quirky fact: counterfeit relics were so common that even church officials sometimes doubted their authenticity. Yet the trade continued because relics brought prestige, wealth, and constant streams of pilgrims who filled the donation boxes. At last you arrive at a grand cathedral. Its spire pierces the clouds, and inside light streams through stained glass windows that paint the floor in jewel colors. The relic here is said to be the robe of Christ himself. Pilgrims fall to their knees, some sobbing, others whispering prayers so fast they blur into a hum. You step forward, feeling the weight of the moment, and brush your hand against the fabric. It's rough, coarse, and surprisingly ordinary. Yet the air around it crackles with belief, as though centuries of prayers have seeped into its threads. Historians still argue whether relics truly held spiritual power, or whether they were symbols of community and control. You decide it doesn't matter. Watching the pilgrims, you see that faith itself is the miracle. The strength to keep walking, to endure hardship, to believe in light even when the world feels dim. That night, lying in the shadow of the cathedral, you hear the murmurs of pilgrims around you, their voices blending into a lullaby of hope and longing. You close your eyes, thinking of monks copying scrolls, of peasants clutching charms, of warriors raising cups to both Odin and Christ, and now of relics, bones, cloth, wood, that bind people together across miles of mud and centuries of forgetting. The Dark Ages may be full of shadows, but in these small, flickering acts of devotion you feel the glow of something that refuses to die. The cathedral's spire fades into the dawn haze behind you as you wander farther along the rutted road. Your cloak is heavier with the smell of incense now, and your stomach still remembers the goose feather relic you almost bought. The morning air is sharp and damp, and with every step you take you notice a nervous hush among the travelers around you. They glance sideways at each other, avoiding talk of saints and relics. Instead, whispers pass between them like dry leaves in the wind. Rumors of sickness, of a strange and sudden death creeping across villages like an invisible thief in the night. The word plague is spoken rarely, as though naming it might summon it closer. You pause to watch a group of people at the roadside. A man coughs, a rasping sound that seems to echo too long, and the crowd shuffles away from him as though he carries fire in his lungs. A young woman presses a cloth of lavender to her face, convinced it will protect her. A child tugs at your sleeve, eyes wide, asking if the devil can ride on the wind. You don't answer, because honestly, in this time, it's easier to imagine demons than bacteria. Mainstream historical fact: after the collapse of Rome, Europe experienced repeated waves of epidemic disease, the most notorious being the Justinian plague of the 6th century and, later, the Black Death of the 14th century. The Justinian plague alone killed millions, perhaps a third of the population of the Byzantine Empire. People had no germ theory, no microscopes, no antibiotics, so they reached for explanations in the only frameworks they knew: God's anger, bad air, or curses. You find yourself stepping carefully past a small hut with its door marked by a smear of ash. No one goes near it. The family inside has been struck and the village has sealed them off. You catch a glimpse of a pale hand through a crack in the door, then hear the faintest cough. The sound lingers in your ears long after you've walked on. Yet amid this fear there are flashes of ingenuity. Some households hang herbs, rosemary, thyme, sage, in their doorways, hoping the strong smell will chase away bad air. And oddly enough, quirky tidbit, some of these aromatic plants did contain antibacterial oils. People also burned juniper branches to cleanse the air, which might not have stopped the plague, but at least left the place smelling like a medieval day spa. You take in the scent of herbs and smoke, imagining yourself lying back with cucumber slices on your eyes, except the cucumbers here are probably pickled for winter rations. You reach a market town, but instead of the usual bustle, the square feels eerie. Stalls are half empty, shutters drawn, and a stray dog noses through discarded bread. A man in a long-beaked mask glides through the street, his robe brushing the cobblestones. At first you think he's wearing some kind of creepy carnival costume, but then you realize he's a plague doctor. His bird-like mask is stuffed with herbs and flowers, meant to filter out the deadly miasma. He stops by a door, lifts his stick, and raps 3 times. You shiver, because in this age that knock is almost always followed by mourning. You pause to rest on a stone step, the chill from the ground creeping into your bones. A woman passes carrying a bouquet of garlic and roses, muttering that the smell will protect her children. A group of villagers walks by with a cart, and you glance inside. Covered in cloth, it seems to hold bodies. You look away quickly, focusing instead on the play of light on the church's stained glass. The colors ripple like jewels on water, and for a moment, the darkness lifts. Historians still argue about how society responded to the Great Plagues. Some chronicles describe towns collapsing into chaos, with families abandoning one another and priests fleeing their flocks. Others record stories of remarkable compassion, of neighbors nursing the sick even at great risk. You imagine yourself sitting by a fire with one of those neighbors, both of you exhausted, sharing a piece of stale bread. You ask him why he helps, and he shrugs. "Because someone once helped me," he says simply. The night creeps in again, heavy and cold. You lie down on a pallet of straw in the corner of the hall, the air still thick with the smell of smoke and garlic. Somewhere outside you hear the eerie sound of bells tolling slowly, carried on the wind. It is a warning, a mourning, and a lullaby all at once. You close your eyes, listening to the rhythm of the bells, and you wonder, did people in the Dark Ages truly forget knowledge, or did they simply lack the tools to explain what they saw? Historians still debate whether the Black Death slowed Europe's progress or forced it into new directions by shaking up old systems. To you, lying here with the echo of bells in your ears, it feels like both. A world teetering between collapse and rebirth, between fear and survival. The straw cradles your head, scratchy but oddly comforting. You feel your breath slow, your eyelids heavy. Outside, the night deepens, the bells toll, and the air thickens with silence. And as you drift, you can almost imagine the lost voices of scholars whispering through the smoke, their words carried on the wind, waiting for someone, anyone, to remember them. You awaken to a different sound this time. Not bells tolling, not axes clashing, but the steady rhythm of a loom. The village you've wandered into smells less of smoke and more of fresh bread and sheep's wool, and as you drift through its narrow lanes you notice something striking. Amid the mud huts and timber halls, women move with quiet authority. They're not merely fetching water or tending children. Some stand at the center of the community, giving instructions, settling disputes, and even scribbling notes on scraps of parchment with more confidence than many of the monks you saw earlier. This is the hidden face of the Dark Ages, one history books sometimes tuck away in the margins. You're invited into a small stone building with narrow windows and a heavy wooden door. Inside, a group of women are gathered around a table covered in herbs, jars, and candles. They are abbesses, leaders of a convent that doubles as a place of healing, learning, and refuge. One of them, her hair tucked neatly beneath a white wimple, speaks with quiet authority. The men in the room, farmers, warriors, even a local priest, listen attentively. You blink, a little surprised. Weren't women in the Middle Ages supposed to be silent, subservient, tucked away in the background? Mainstream historical fact: in early medieval Europe, religious women often wielded considerable influence. Abbesses like Hilda of Whitby in 7th century England or Hildegard of Bingen in the 12th century were not just spiritual leaders, but also scholars, advisors to kings, and sometimes even political actors. They managed estates, taught literacy, and preserved knowledge in ways that rivaled their male counterparts. So while the period is often painted as dominated by men in armor, there were women behind convent walls quietly shaping the course of thought and faith. One of the younger nuns offers you a cup of herbal tea. The taste is sharp, almost medicinal, but soothing as it slides down your throat. She explains that it's brewed from sage and chamomile, good for calming the heart and settling the stomach. Quirky tidbit: medieval women healers often recommended wormwood wine for stomach aches and urine therapy for just about everything else. You shudder, grateful that your cup doesn't taste like the latter. As the women chant their prayers, you notice a mural on the wall. It shows a saint, but not the usual stern male figure. This one is a woman, halo glowing, standing on a dragon's back while holding a cross high. The abbess catches your eye and explains that this is Saint Margaret of Antioch, who supposedly escaped from the belly of a dragon by making the sign of the cross. Historians still argue whether Margaret was ever a real person, or whether her story was adapted from older goddess myths. But for these women, she's proof that holiness isn't limited to men with swords. The convent is also a school. You hear the chatter of young girls reciting their Latin letters, their voices rising and falling like birdsong. One girl stumbles over a phrase, and the nun taps her on the head, not harshly, more like a gentle reminder. You smile, remembering your own school days, when forgetting multiplication tables felt like the end of the world. Here, forgetting a line of Latin is just another part of keeping memory alive. As night approaches, you find yourself outside again, walking along a narrow path that winds past a row of small cottages. Inside you see women spinning wool by firelight, their hands moving so quickly the thread seems to appear by magic. A mother hums a lullaby while rocking her baby, her voice soft and low. You pause to listen. The words are half in Latin, half in some older tongue, the melody simple but haunting. It's not just a song, it's a lifeline, a way to keep the old traditions alive while embracing the new. You duck into one of the cottages where a woman is mixing herbs in a clay pot. She explains she's making a salve for burns using lard and rose oil. She insists that if you chant the right prayer while stirring, the salve will draw out the fire from the wound. You nod politely, though you're distracted by the fact that she's stirring clockwise, then counterclockwise, then stopping to mutter something about saints. It's part science, part magic, part ritual, an improvised medicine cabinet for a world that lost its textbooks. Quirky tidbit: in some medieval villages, people believed that wearing a necklace of live earthworms would cure headaches. You imagine yourself draped in wriggling jewelry, trying to look fashionable while quietly praying no one notices your slimy accessories. Suddenly, garlic necklaces don't seem so bad. Later you find yourself at a long wooden table again, this time surrounded not by knights and priests but by women of every age. They talk about herbs, about childbirth, about visions of saints who appear in dreams. One woman swears she saw a figure in white walking across the fields at night. Another insists it was just mist catching the moonlight. Historians still argue about how much influence women like these had outside their convents and homes. Some were celebrated as visionaries, while others were accused of witchcraft for the very same practices. You think of how thin the line is between sainthood and suspicion, between miracle worker and heretic. The fire in the center of the hall burns low, casting the women's faces in warm, flickering light. They sing softly, their voices weaving together like threads on the loom you heard earlier. You lie back on a straw pallet, the warmth of the fire sinking into your bones. Outside, the wind rattles the shutters, carrying with it the distant sound of a wolf's howl. You pull the rough blanket taut. Gita, comforted by the hum of the women's voices, which blur into a lullaby older than any book, older even than Rome itself. And as your eyelids grow heavy, you realize something. While the world may call this age dark, it glows in unexpected places, quiet convents, smoky huts, and whispered songs. Knowledge may be forgotten, but it also survives, hidden in plain sight, waiting for the right moment to shine again. You wake to the sound of gulls screeching overhead, their cries sharper than any monk's bell. The air tastes of salt, briny and heavy, and as you blink yourself back into awareness, you realize you've stumbled far from the damp huts and the monasteries of the Western lands. The world around you is brighter here, sun bouncing off marble and mosaics that glisten like jewels in the early light. Before you, rising from the sea as if it had been conjured by a spell, is Constantinople, the city that refused to fall when the West collapsed, the so-called New Rome. You step onto a bustling dock where merchants shout in a dozen different tongues. Greek, Latin, Arabic, Slavic, and even languages you can't place swirl together, forming a strange symphony of trade. Silk bolts shimmer in the morning air like rainbow waterfalls. Spices perfume the streets with sharp cinnamon and smoky cloves, and coins clink in so many hands you can't help but think, this doesn't look very dark at all. A mainstream historical fact. While the western half of the Roman Empire crumbled in the 5th century, the eastern half, known to us as the Byzantine Empire, endured for nearly 1,000 more years. Its capital, Constantinople, sat at the crossroads of Europe and Asia, controlling trade between the Mediterranean and the Silk Road. Far from a cultural wasteland, it became a glittering hub of art, learning, and commerce. Some historians even argue the term Dark Ages is unfair, since Constantinople preserved and expanded much of the knowledge that the West forgot. You wander through the crowded markets, ducking under hanging fabrics, listening to the clink of bronze scales weighing coins. Vendors hawk everything from honey-soaked pastries to strange powders in small clay jars. One merchant leans toward you and insists his jar contains ground unicorn horn, guaranteed to cure any poison. Quirky tidbit. Our medieval traders often passed off powdered narwhal tusk as unicorn horn, selling it for absurd sums. You imagine some poor knight forking over a fortune for a magical antidote, only to discover he's just been drinking very expensive fish dust. At least it makes for a good campfire story. You step into the Hagia Sophia, and immediately your jaw goes slack. The air is cool, filled with golden light that spills from massive windows high above. The dome seems impossibly large, as though the sky itself has bent down to rest above your head. Mosaics glitter in every direction, tiny bits of colored glass arranged into saints, angels, and symbols you half recognize. The sound of chanting echoes in waves, wrapping around you like a blanket. You sink into the rhythm, the voices rising and falling like the sea. If you weren't careful, you might drift off right here on the stone floor, the world dissolving in a haze of gold and song. At the edge of the sanctuary, a scribe gestures to you. He holds up a manuscript, its pages heavy with Greek text, the letters neat and elegant. He explains with a proud smile that they are copying the works of Plato and Aristotle, preserving the wisdom of the ancients while the West fumbles in darkness. You nod, marveling at the thought that so much of what you know today, philosophy, science, even geometry, survived because of places like this. Without Byzantium, you might never have heard of Socrates, let alone Plato's cave. But not everyone here is reading Plato. You hear whispers of a religious council, bishops arguing over whether Christ was fully human, fully divine, or some mystical blend of both. The debates are fierce, echoing through the halls like thunder. Historians still argue about just how much these theological disputes shaped the empire's politics, but you can see their power firsthand. Arguments over a single word, homoousios, can split communities, spark riots, and even topple emperors. You think about how many wars have been fought over spelling mistakes, and it makes you shake your head. Imagine starting a bar fight because someone wrote your instead of your. As the sun sets, you climb the city's ancient walls. Below, torches flicker in the streets and the sea glows silver beneath the rising moon. You run your hands over the stone, noticing the careful layers of construction, Roman brick at the base, Byzantine stone above, patched with whatever the masons could find. It's a fortress, but also a palimpsest, a city written and rewritten over centuries. You think of the monks copying texts, the peasants scratching prayers into door frames, and now this city, an entire civilization writing its story over old lines, layering memory upon memory. And then you hear it, the faint boom of drums across the water. You squint, and on the horizon you see the faint outline of ships. Not Viking longships this time, but something different, sleek, with tall triangular sails moving silently in the night. A guard beside you spits over the wall and mutters a word you recognize: Arabs, the new force rising from the desert, carrying with them not only swords but also mathematics, medicine, and philosophy. Quirky tidbit: while the West was struggling to remember how to make soap, scholars in Baghdad were translating Greek texts, inventing algebra, and building hospitals that actually practiced quarantine. You picture a Byzantine guard peering at those ships and muttering, "Oh no, they're bringing advanced science." The irony isn't lost on you. Historians still argue whether Byzantium was a true continuation of Rome or a new civilization entirely. Some see it as the last flickering flame of the empire, others as the first spark of something different, a blend of Greek, Roman, and Christian traditions. You, leaning against the cold stone wall, aren't sure it matters. What you see is a city glowing in the darkness, holding tightly to the knowledge the West had misplaced, like a light shining over a restless sea. The drums fade into the night. You climb down from the wall and wander through the city streets, past bakeries where the smell of warm bread drifts through the air, past bathhouses where steam curls into the night sky. You pause outside one bathhouse, tempted by the thought of warm water and a place to scrub the mud off your legs. Mainstream fact: public baths were one of the Roman luxuries the Byzantines managed to maintain long after the West had forgotten them. While peasants in Europe bathed only a few times a year, Constantinople had functioning aqueducts and public bathhouses where people gathered to wash, socialize, and, inevitably, gossip. Inside, you find marble floors slick with steam, mosaics glimmering under torchlight, and men lounging in pools of warm water. The sound of laughter and splashing fills the room, a strange contrast to the hushed fear of the plague-haunted villages. A man explains proudly that the city's aqueducts are centuries old, still carrying water across impossible distances. You sink into the water, sighing as the warmth soaks into your aching legs. It feels almost like stepping into a modern hot tub, except without the annoying jets or the smell of chlorine. A merchant tells you stories of the great markets beyond the sea: Baghdad, Damascus, Alexandria, places where scholars study the stars and doctors actually wash their hands before treating wounds. You close your eyes, imagining rows of scrolls in Arabic, Greek, and Persian, all carefully copied and debated in glittering halls. He insists that one day all this knowledge will find its way west again. Historians still argue whether Byzantium was a mere caretaker of knowledge or an innovator in its own right. But in this warm bathhouse, steam rising and voices echoing like whispers in a dream, it feels like the city is less a caretaker and more a gur. Diane, standing on the edge of the dark, holding a torch. You slip back into the night, your skin still warm, your body heavy with drowsiness. The city hums around you, markets closing, guards patrolling, candles flickering in high windows. You curl up in the shadow of the great walls, the stone cool against your back, and watch the stars wink above the sea. Knowledge may have been forgotten in the West, but here in Constantinople it still breathes, still flickers, still waits. And as your eyes drift shut, you think, maybe the Dark Ages weren't entirely dark after all. Maybe the light just moved east for a while, hiding behind marble walls, waiting for the dawn. You awaken to the sound of hooves clattering on stone, but when you open your eyes, it's not Europe that greets you. The world around you has shifted. The cool mists of Constantinople give way to dry, warm air laced with spices so rich they make your nose tingle. The sun is higher now, glowing through a haze of desert dust, and the city before you is alive with color. Blue-glazed tiles shimmer like captured sky, minarets stretch like spears, and the call of a muezzin ripples through the morning air, long and melodic. You've wandered eastward into the heart of the Islamic Golden Age, the dazzling world of Baghdad and the Arabian scholars. The streets pulse with energy. Merchants shout in Arabic, Persian, and Greek. Silk drapes ripple in the hot breeze while traders haggle over ivory, glassware, and cinnamon that smells like every bakery you've ever loved. The scents mix: sandalwood smoke, roasted lamb, fresh mint tea, and it's like walking through a medieval spice market version of a perfume shop. You weave between stalls, careful not to knock over a jar of saffron that's worth more than your entire outfit. You consider buying a pouch, but then realize your pockets contain only lint and a crumb of stale bread from last night's feast. Not exactly legal tender here. Mainstream historical fact: between the 8th and 13th centuries, the Islamic world became a center of learning, trade, and innovation. Cities like Baghdad, Damascus, and Cordoba preserved and translated ancient Greek, Persian, and Indian texts, including works by Aristotle, Hippocrates, and Euclid. Scholars developed algebra, advanced medicine, astronomy, and even early chemistry, alchemy in its experimental phase. While much of Europe struggled to preserve literacy, these cities were building libraries with hundreds of thousands of volumes. You drift into the House of Wisdom, Baghdad's legendary library and research center. Inside, the air is thick with parchment, ink, and the smell of oiled lamps. Scholars sit cross-legged on carpets, scrolls spread around them like fallen leaves. One man traces equations in the dust with his finger, muttering about al-Jabr, the art of restoring balance. You realize you're watching the birth of algebra, though you try not to panic when he casually solves equations that would make your high school math teacher weep with joy. You lean over to peek at another scholar's parchment and see diagrams of stars, circles within circles, lines marking the paths of planets. He explains that they are charting the heavens, mapping the movement of the stars more accurately than anyone has before. They've even given names to stars you recognize from your own night sky: Aldebaran, Betelgeuse, Rigel, Quirky Tidbit. Many of the star names we use today are Arabic in origin, preserved through this period when European scholars had forgotten much of Greek astronomy. Without these translations, you might be calling Orion's brightest star Random Sparkle Thing Number 1. As you wander between the shelves, you can't help but notice how many of the manuscripts here were once Roman or Greek. Plato, Aristotle, Galen, Hippocrates, the same names you heard wit, spared in the monasteries, now carefully translated into Arabic. The monks copied the texts to preserve them. The scholars here debate them, expand on them, and argue over their meaning late into the night. Historians still argue whether this era was about preserving knowledge or transforming it, but you can see both happening at once. To you, sitting cross-legged among scholars in flowing robes, it feels like knowledge has not vanished. It's simply changed addresses. As evening falls, the library glows with lamplight. The scholars roll up their scrolls, stretch their stiff legs, and head outside into the warm night air. You follow them through winding streets lit by lanterns swinging gently in the breeze. Somewhere nearby, a group of musicians plays a haunting tune on flutes and drums, the rhythm slow and hypnotic. You find yourself swaying to the sound, your eyelids heavy, the spice-laden air wrapping around you like a blanket. You duck into a small cafe. Yes, a cafe, though it's not quite the cozy, laptop-filled version you're used to. The air is thick with the smell of something dark and bitter. A man pours a steaming liquid into a small cup and offers it to you. You take a sip and nearly cough. The taste is sharp, earthy, almost burnt, but it sends a jolt of warmth through your chest. Quirky fact: many historians believe that coffee drinking spread from the Islamic world, where it was first brewed by Sufi mystics to stay awake during long nights of prayer. Imagine monks staying up not with energy drinks or late-night pizza, but with cups of strong, bitter coffee that probably tasted like liquefied campfire. The cafe is crowded with merchants, scholars, and travelers. They debate everything from poetry to medicine to the proper way to calculate the circumference of the Earth. One man insists that the Earth is round, citing the work of Al-Biruni, who in the 11th century estimated the planet's circumference with remarkable accuracy, closer to the true figure than many later European attempts. Another man shakes his head, insisting the Earth is flat because that's what his uncle told him. Historians still argue how widely accepted the round Earth was in medieval Europe, but here in Baghdad it's almost common knowledge. You sip your coffee, trying not to grimace, and think maybe the real secret of the Dark Ages is that the dark wasn't evenly distributed. As the night deepens, you wander back into the streets. The minarets glow against the sky, and the air is filled with the sound of evening prayers, soft, melodic, almost like the monks chanting, but with a rhythm that sways instead of marches. You pause in the shadow of a column, listening. The voices rise and fall like waves on a shore, lulling you into that dreamlike state again. You lean against the cool stone, close your eyes, and remember the monks copying texts by candlelight, the peasants clutching garlic for protection, the Vikings polishing their combs between raids. Now, here in the East, knowledge thrives, stars mapped, medicines tested, stories written in flowing script that will one day make their way back west. You let the warm desert breeze wash over you, carrying the scent of spices and smoke. Somewhere nearby, a scholar is still muttering over equations, a poet is reciting verses under the moon, and a merchant is probably still trying to sell powdered unicorn horn. You smile faintly at the absurdity of it all. Even in the so-called Dark Ages there are sparks of brilliance, tiny lamps glowing in the night, waiting to guide you forward. And as your body grows heavy, your mind drifts, lulled by the rhythm of chants and the taste of bitter coffee still lingering on your tongue. You wonder if, centuries from now, people will call your age dark too, or if they'll see, as you do, that even in the shadows, light never really goes out. You wake with the strange aftertaste of bitter coffee still clinging to your tongue, though the cup you held last night has long since vanished into the dream mist. The morning sun spills over tiled domes and shining minarets, but you are already walking away, drawn westward by the sound of clashing metal. The desert air fades, replaced by the cooler bite of a European breeze, and soon you find yourself standing on a dirt road where armored figures march in a line. The ground shakes beneath their boots, and the rattle of chainmail is like a bag of coins being shaken again and again. You squint against the light and realize you are among knights, grim-faced men in iron helms, their eyes peering through narrow slits as they march with swords and shields. Their banners flap overhead, painted with crosses, lions, and dragons. To your sleepy mind, it looks less like a disciplined army and more like a very noisy parade, one that forgot to invite a marching band. Still, there's an air of seriousness here. These men are not going to a festival. They're marching toward what they believe is holy war. Mainstream historical fact: the Crusades began in the late 11th century when Pope Urban II called on Christians to reclaim the Holy Land from Muslim control. The First Crusade set off in 1096, drawing knights, peasants, and adventurers from across Europe. It wasn't just about faith, though that was the banner it flew under. It was also about land, power, trade, and for many younger sons of noble families, the chance to carve out their own fortune. As you walk alongside them, one knight proudly explains why he's marching east. "God wills it," he says, thumping his chest with his gauntleted fist. His armor gleams in the morning sun, though you notice it squeaks when he moves, like a very shiny, very deadly door hinge. Another knight leans in and mutters, "Honestly, I'm just tired of my older brother inheriting everything. If I can snag a castle in the Holy Land, maybe my kids will finally have a roof that doesn't leak." You nod politely, trying not to mention that half the castles you've seen so far are already falling apart. Quirky tidbit: not everyone in the Crusades was a noble knight. Thousands of ordinary peasants joined, believing that by marching to the Holy Land they could wipe away their sins and guarantee a ticket to heaven. Some were so eager they didn't even wait for the official armies. They formed what became known as the People's Crusade. A chaotic, badly organized movement that ended in disaster. Imagine trying to storm a heavily fortified city with little more than pitchforks, kitchen knives, and a lot of enthusiasm. It went about as well as you'd expect. The road is dusty, the sun climbs higher, and you can feel sweat soaking into your cloak. The knights march on, chanting hymns, their voices rough but determined. A group of women follow behind, carrying water and bread. Some are wives, others are camp followers, and some are disguised as men, hoping no one notices. You watch as one of them adjusts her helmet, trying to keep her hair tucked in, and you think, if medieval makeup tutorials had existed, this woman would be the star, demonstrating how to blend foundation and chainmail for that perfect crusader glow. As the column halts for the night, the knights set up camp, Fires spark across the field, and soon the smell of roasting meat fills the air. You wander between the tents, watching men mend armor, polish swords, and tell stories of battles yet to be fought. One grizzled veteran tells a tale of the siege of Antioch, where starving crusaders supposedly ate leather, grass, and, according to some reports, even resorted to cannibalism. Historians still argue about how widespread this actually was. Some say it was exaggerated. Irritated by enemies of the Crusaders, others believe it did happen during the desperate days of siege warfare. You quietly hope tonight's dinner stays firmly in the roasted goat category. As you settle near a fire, a knight begins describing the treasures of Jerusalem: golden chalices, jewel-encrusted altars, and the chance to walk where Christ once walked. His eyes shine with something between faith and greed. You glance down at your own hands, empty except for a half-eaten hunk of bread, and wonder if you'd march for weeks across deserts just for the promise of forgiveness, or maybe for a shiny goblet or two. The night is restless. Horses neigh in the distance, their silhouettes shifting against the firelight. You hear whispered prayers, the murmur of men begging God for protection, and then, softer still, the sound of dice rolling on a wooden board. Quirky tidbit: despite their holy mission, Crusaders loved gambling. Chroniclers complained about knights wasting their money on games of chance, sometimes losing their armor, their horses, or even their clothes. You imagine the awkwardness of explaining to your commander that you can't fight tomorrow because you gambled away your chainmail. A priest walks past, shaking his head at the gamblers, then blessing the weary soldiers. He stops to speak with you, explaining that the crusade is both penance and promise. God wills it, he repeats, as though those 3 words are enough to light the way east. You nod, though deep down you wonder whether God really has a travel itinerary that includes encouraging men to march thousands of miles in uncomfortable armor. Historians still argue whether the Crusades were driven more by religion, politics, or economics. And as you watch men laughing around the fire with their dice, you suspect the answer is all of the above. Later, as the camp falls into silence, you find a spot near the edge, where the grass is cool and the stars overhead are bright enough to sting your eyes. You lie back, listening to the faint snores, the occasional jingle of a horse's bridle, and the whisper of the night wind. The world around you is still precarious, still shadowed, but here in the quiet you feel the determination that carried these knights, peasants, and dreamers across continents. You close your eyes, imagining the longships fading into the mist, the monasteries glowing with candlelight, the villagers clutching garlic charms, and now these knights marching east with more faith than food. Knowledge may have been forgotten, but the desire for meaning, whether through relics, prayers, or sword strokes, burns bright, guiding you deeper into this strange, half-lit age. The night is long, and your dreams are restless. When you finally rise again, the air is thick with mist, curling low over the fields like smoke from a dying fire. You follow the road onward, your footsteps squelching in the damp earth, until you hear voices, high sing-song voices that don't sound like prayers or chants, but something more playful. You follow the sound through a small copse of trees, and there, by a glowing fire, a group of travelers has gathered. They sit in a circle, their faces painted by flickering light, and one of them is telling a story. You sink into the grass and listen. The tale is about a dragon, massive, fire-breathing, scales shining like molten bronze. The villagers lean forward as the storyteller waves his hands dramatically, describing knights charging into the beast's mouth, shields raised, only to be spat back out smoking. His eyes sparkle as he stretches the tale, every pause drawing the crowd tighter into his words. You know, of course, that dragons don't exist, but in this moment, with the fire crackling and shadows leaping like wings on the trees, you could almost believe. Mainstream historical fact: the Middle Ages were a golden age for myth and legend. From the Chanson de Geste in France to the sagas of Iceland, stories carried history, morality, and entertainment all in one. Knights like Roland, Arthur, and Beowulf straddled the line between fact and fiction, becoming symbols of courage and faith. These stories were not just bedtime distractions. They were the Netflix, the comic books, and the superhero movies of their day. People gathered around fires, not screens, to hear them again and again. As the tale winds on, the storyteller pulls out a carved wooden dragon, its mouth open in a permanent roar. Children gasp, reaching for it, and he lets one small boy hold it. The boy waves it through the smoke, and everyone laughs. Cue. Worky tidbit. In medieval bestiaries, those illustrated books of animals, both real and imaginary, creatures like dragons, unicorns, and manticores were described right alongside lions and elephants, as if they were just another species you might bump into on a walk. One manuscript even describes a kind of dog that could talk. You glance at a stray hound sitting by the fire and half expect it to lean over and critique your posture. The storyteller's voice grows softer as he shifts from dragons to saints. He tells of Saint Christopher, who, according to some medieval legends, was once a literal giant with a dog's head. Yes, a dog-headed saint. He supposedly carried travelers across rivers, one of whom turned out to be Christ himself, disguised as a child. The villagers nod, comforted by the idea that even a monstrous figure could become holy. Historians still argue whether such legends were meant to be taken literally or symbolically. You find yourself wondering whether future generations will believe we literally worshipped superheroes with capes and glowing hammers. The fire crackles lower, and someone else begins to sing a ballad. The tune is simple, repeating like waves on a shore. The story tells of a fox who tricks a vain crow into dropping its cheese, a tale you recognize, one of Aesop's fables that traveled through centuries in countless versions. The villagers laugh as if they've never heard it before, which, for many of them, is probably true. You realize that oral storytelling is not about accuracy, it's about rhythm, comfort, and community. Like a bedtime story told 1,000 times, each telling smooths away details until only the heart of the tale remains. A young woman beside you offers you a hunk of cheese, perhaps inspired by the story. It's hard, sharp, and smells faintly like old socks, but you accept it with a smile. Quirky observation. Medieval cheeses weren't just food. They were a way of storing milk that would otherwise spoil. Some were so hard they could be used as weapons in a pinch. You take a cautious bite and hope no one mistakes you for the crow in the story, waiting for you to drop your prize. The storyteller shifts again, now spinning tales of the great King Arthur. You hear about a sword pulled from stone, about knights who swore oaths of loyalty, about quests for a magical cup that could heal all wounds. You smile sleepily, recognizing the seeds of stories that will echo for centuries, retold in poems, novels, and even movies. Historians still argue whether Arthur ever existed, or whether he was simply a collection of myths stitched together to inspire hope in a time of chaos. But to the listeners around you, he is as real as the firelight on their faces, as real as the mud on your boots. The night grows colder, the stars sharper overhead. You lie back in the grass, the sounds of laughter and song washing over you. Someone stumbles over the firewood and curses, earning more laughter. You grin, leave it to humanity to find comedy in stubbed toes and clumsy knights. Even in an age of uncertainty, the rhythm of stories keeps hearts beating like lullabies sung to restless children. As your eyes drift shut, you remember the monks' doodled rabbits, the peasants' garlic charms, the Viking sagas shouted into smoky air. And now, the storyteller's voice becomes part of that same river of memory, carrying fragments of truth, myth, and hope into the night. You feel yourself floating on that current, lulled by the music of words, as if history itself is whispering you to sleep. You rise again, blinking as dawn light slants through a crack in the wooden shutters. The air outside is brisk, and the dew sparkles like tiny shards of glass scattered across the grass. The path carries you away from the fires and songs of the night before and into a new scene. This time, the sound is not of chanting monks or the clash of steel, but of shouting voices, a crowd gathered in the village square. The tone is sharp, agitated. You step closer, your cloak trailing in the mud, and realize you've stumbled into a trial. Not the kind with powdered wigs, gavels, and lawyers, but the medieval variety, messy, unpredictable, and sometimes a little terrifying. At the center of the square, a man stands with his hands bound, eyes darting around nervously. A judge, robed in heavy wool, calls out accusations in a booming voice while villagers jeer and whisper. A pot of water boils nearby and a heavy iron bar glows in the fire. You feel your stomach sink because you already suspect what's coming. Justice in the Dark Ages wasn't exactly about evidence or cross-examinations. It was about trials by ordeal, tests meant to let God decide guilt or innocence, because why bother with lawyers when you can just throw someone into a river and see if they float? Mainstream historical fact. Trials by ordeal were a common method of justice in early medieval Europe. The idea was simple. God would protect the innocent, while the guilty would be revealed by their suffering. One version was trial by hot water. The accused had to plunge their hand into boiling liquid to retrieve a stone. If the burns healed quickly, they were considered innocent. If not, well, maybe invest in some medieval aloe. Another was trial by combat. Two men fighting with swords or clubs, the victor deemed to have God's favor. The crowd parts as the accused is led forward. He's accused of stealing bread, again a cry. I'm born out of hunger. The judge orders him to grasp the glowing iron. You wince as he picks it up, the smell of burning flesh hitting your nose before you can even look away. He drops it, screaming, and the villagers murmur. A woman whispers, if God wants him to live, his hand will heal. You can't help but think that God must have a very dark sense of humor. Quirky tidbit. Not all ordeals were gruesome. One involved making the accused carry a piece of hot iron a few steps, then wrapping their hand in cloth. If the burn was healing after 3 days, they were innocent. If it festered, guilty. Another ordeal was even stranger. The accused was tied up and thrown into water. If they sank, they were innocent but might drown anyway. If they floated, it meant the pure water was rejecting them as guilty. It's the ultimate lose-lose situation. You imagine yourself sinking like a rock and everyone saying, see, told you they were fine, as you bubble away under the surface. You step back from the crowd, shaken but fascinated. It's not that these people hate justice. It's that their world has lost the legal systems Rome once maintained. Without trained judges, law schools, or reliable records, they turn to the divine to settle disputes. Historians still argue whether ordeals were truly believed to reveal God's will, or whether communities simply used them as a way to reach decisions everyone could accept. To your sleepy mind, it looks a lot like a medieval version of flipping a coin, except the coin is on fire and you have to hold it in your bare hand. As the trial ends, the villagers disperse. Some head back to their fields, others to their workshops. You drift toward a bakery where the smell of fresh bread curls into the air. The baker, his face dusted with flour, is telling a story about how a thief once had to prove his innocence by swallowing a piece of dry bread without choking. If the bread slid down smoothly, he was innocent. If he choked, it was proof of guilt. You take a bite of your own crust from the night before and immediately cough, crumbs catching in your throat. The baker eyes you suspiciously and you quickly wave your hands. No crime here, just bad timing. Later, you find yourself walking past the edge of the village where a small chapel leans against a grove of trees. Inside, you hear more chanting, but this time it's interrupted by shouts. Two men are arguing in front of the altar, their voices echoing. One insists that a wealthy landowner has stolen his cow. The other swears the cow wandered off on its own. The priest sighs, clearly tired of being a part-time judge, and declares that both men will fast for 3 days and then walk barefoot across hot plowshares. Whoever emerges without burns will be the rightful owner. You glance at your already sore feet and think no cow is worth this. Quirky tidbit. Ordeals weren't just for peasants. Even queens and nobles sometimes faced them. One famous example is Queen Emma of Normandy, mother of Edward the Confessor. She was accused of adultery in the 11th century, and to prove her innocence she supposedly walked barefoot over 9 red-hot plowshares without injury. Whether this actually happened or was just a dramatic story invented later is unclear. Historians still argue about it. You imagine trying to explain that to your friends. Yeah, my alibi, I just walked across some burning metal, no big deal. As night falls, the village grows quiet. Again, the air smells faintly of smoke and damp earth. You lie on the grass outside the chapel, the stars above you sharp and cold. Somewhere nearby a dog barks and you hear the rustle of leaves in the wind. You close your eyes, the echo of chanting and laughter still humming in your ears, the memory of glowing iron bars burned into your mind. The Dark Ages may be remembered as an age of forgetting, but as you drift into sleep again, you realize it's also an age of belief. belief in justice, in miracles, in stories, even if they don't always make sense. And as your breath slows, you feel yourself floating once again, carried forward into the next chapter of this long, shadowed journey through the night. The echoes of the trial fade behind you as you wander onward, your cloak dragging over stones and earth, the night air cool against your skin. The road bends, and suddenly you hear laughter, raucous, unrestrained, like a wave breaking through centuries of silence. The sound grows louder, mixed with the ringing of bells and the squeal of bagpipes. You follow it into a town square where lanterns blaze in every corner, and you realize you've stumbled into a festival. Not the solemn prayers of the monks or the grim marches of crusaders, but something altogether stranger, wilder, and honestly much more fun. The streets are alive with colour. Ribbons flutter from wooden beams, children dart between the legs of oxen decorated with painted horns, and grown men wear crowns made of cabbage leaves. A man dressed as a bishop stumbles around, clearly not a real bishop, unless real bishops usually juggle turnips while shouting bad jokes. The crowd roars with laughter as he blesses a piglet in Latin that's definitely not in the Bible. For a moment you wonder if you've walked into a medieval prank show. Mainstream historical fact: the Feast of Fools was a real medieval festival, especially popular in France around the 12th and 13th centuries. During this celebration, roles were reversed. Peasants dressed as priests, choir boys wore the bishop's mitre, and parades were filled with mockery and satire. It was a sanctioned day of chaos, a way to let off steam in a society that was otherwise rigidly controlled by hierarchy and tradition. You squeeze through the crowd and find yourself in front of a wooden stage. A group of young men, their faces painted with soot, are reenacting a scene from scripture. Only instead of solemn prophets, they're shouting jokes, turning sermons into slapstick, and using farm tools as props. The crowd howls, and even the real priest, standing stiffly at the edge of the square, can't help but smirk before quickly crossing himself. The air is thick with the smell of roasting meat, goose, pork, even fish skewered over open flames. You accept a hunk of bread dripping with fat, and the taste is so rich it makes your head spin. You glance around and notice barrels being rolled into the square. They're filled with ale, and villagers crowd around with cups, mugs, and in one case a very ambitious helmet. Quirky tidbit: at some medieval festivals, people literally roasted entire animals and served them in elaborate ways, like pigs stuffed with birds or pies that exploded with live frogs. Apparently the goal was to surprise and delight your guests while also making them scream. Medieval dinner theatre was not for the faint of heart. You nibble on your greasy bread and watch as the festival grows rowdier. Men dressed as women twirl in the firelight, their rough wool skirts swishing as they stumble into laughter. A group of children march through the square, banging on pots and pans, declaring themselves kings for the day. Everyone cheers because tonight the world is upside down. Lords are mocked, peasants play rulers, and for once the darkness feels less heavy. Historians still argue about the purpose of these festivals. Were they simply a safety valve, a way to let the lower classes mock their betters for one day so they wouldn't revolt the rest of the year? Or were they genuine celebrations of community where laughter and chaos reminded people that life, however grim, still had joy hidden in its corners? As you lean against a wooden post watching a man in a donkey mask stumble into a puddle, you decide it doesn't matter. Sometimes laughter is the only knowledge worth keeping. As the night deepens, the festival grows wilder. Drums pound, flutes squeal, and the crowd dances in uneven circles. Someone hands you a mask made of painted wood, with a long nose that keeps poking you in the chin. You put it on anyway, blending into the swirl of bodies. For a moment you forget the ruins, the plague, the cold stone walls. You are simply another shadow among shadows, moving to the rhythm of music that feels eternal. But even here in the heart of laughter, the darkness creeps in. A man collapses near the fire, his face pale, his breathing ragged. The music falters, the crowd freezes, and then slowly, awkwardly, the dancing resumes. People step around him as though pretending not to see will make the sickness vanish. You watch, torn between pity and unease, as two men quietly drag him away into the shadows. The festival continues, louder now, as if to drown out the silence he left behind. You wander away from the square, the mask still dangling from your hand. The music fades behind you, replaced by the rustle of wind through the trees. The road is lit only by the moon, its pale light stretching shadows across the ground. You think about what you've seen: monks preserving texts, peasants clinging to rituals, Vikings singing sagas, and now peasants mocking their lords in wild, chaotic festivals. Knowledge may have been forgotten, but laughter, faith, and stories kept people moving forward. Quirky observation. In some medieval festivals, people even elected a lord of misrule, a peasant chosen to play the role of ruler for a day. He gave absurd orders like making the bishop serve drinks or forcing the local lord to dance in the mud. You imagine your boss being forced to juggle turnips in front of everyone and chuckle softly. Maybe medieval people weren't so different after all. Historians still argue whether these festivals were subversive, small ACs, TS of rebellion against rigid hierarchy, or whether they were actually safety mechanisms carefully tolerated by the elites to keep the peasants satisfied. To you, wandering through the quiet streets after the laughter has faded, it feels like both. For one night, people could laugh at their rulers, mock the church, and pretend the world was upside down. And when morning came, they would go back to their fields and their huts, a little lighter, a little more able to endure the darkness. You find a quiet spot near a barn, the grass soft beneath you, the night air cool and still. The faint echo of music lingers like a memory you can't quite shake. You close your eyes, the mask slipping from your fingers, and drift into sleep. In your dreams, dragons fly overhead. Saints wrestle them into rivers, and peasants in cabbage crowns laugh until their sides ache. The Dark Ages may have forgotten much, but they never forgot how to tell a story, how to laugh, how to find a spark of light in the night. The laughter from the festival fades into the night, swallowed by a silence so complete it almost hums in your ears. When you open your eyes again, the air is crisp, the sky painted with the pale blush of dawn, and the road ahead stretches like a ribbon of earth through rolling fields. You rise slowly, your limbs stiff from sleep on the hard ground, and begin to walk once more. The land feels different here. The huts are sturdier, the fields larger, the people a little less desperate. Something is shifting in this world, and though the age is still called dark, you can sense sparks of light scattered everywhere, like stars before sunrise. As you approach a bustling crossroads, the sound of voices grows louder, but it's not the panicked shouting of a raid or the raucous laughter of a festival. It's the hum of trade, the rhythm of haggling, the clink of coins, the creak of wagons laden with goods. You've arrived at a medieval fair, and suddenly, the Dark Ages don't feel so dark at all. Merchants from distant towns have gathered here, their carts piled high with bolts of cloth, wheels of cheese hard as stone, and spices that make your nose twitch even before you see them. You drift past a stall where a man is grinding peppercorns, the sharp scent making your eyes water. A group of children runs past, clutching candied nuts, their faces sticky with sugar. You smile faintly. It feels almost like a modern street market, just with more mud and fewer health inspectors. Mainstream historical fact: by the 12th and 13th centuries, Europe was seeing a revival of trade and urban life. Great fairs, especially in places like Champagne in France, became hubs where merchants from Italy, Flanders, and even the Middle East came to exchange goods. These fairs weren't just about commerce, they were about ideas, languages, and cultures colliding. A piece of silk from the East might pass through dozens of hands before reaching a noble's shoulders, carrying stories and knowledge along with it. You step into a tent where scribes are selling books, not handwritten manuscripts by monks this time, but early translations of Arabic works on medicine, astronomy, and mathematics. The parchment is still precious, the ink still costly, but here it feels as though knowledge is slipping back into the light. One scholar explains that merchants brought not just goods but also ideas, new ways of calculating, new stories, new instruments. He proudly shows you an astrolabe, a shining disc of brass etched with circles and numbers. It looks like a medieval fidget spinner, except instead of calming your nerves, it helps sailors find their way across oceans. Quirky tidbit. The Champagne fairs were so famous that they became the medieval equivalent of Comic-Con, complete with crowds, costumes, and questionable food. People came not only to buy spices or cloth, but also to hear poets recite, jugglers perform, and musicians play. One chronicler complained that the fairs were so noisy and crowded that a man could lose his purse, his shoes, and his virtue all before breakfast. You laugh softly, clutching your cloak a little tighter, and decide to keep both your purse and your virtue intact. As you wander deeper into the fair, you notice something new. Coins are everywhere. No more chopping silver into fragments or trading goats for grain. Merchants clink silver pennies and gold florins, weighing them carefully on brass scales. Mainstream fact: the revival of trade in the High Middle Ages was accompanied by the rise of currency-based economies. Italian city-states like Florence minted the florin, which became a trusted coin across Europe. This made trade easier and helped finance everything from cathedrals to crusades. You glance at one of the coins, a tiny shining disc that somehow represents weeks of labor for the peasants you saw in the fields, and wonder how something so small can hold so much power. The sun sets and lanterns light up the fairground in a warm glow. Performers take the stage, juggling torches and playing lutes. A group of dancers spins in circles, their skirts flaring like flames. You sit on a barrel, chewing on a roasted chestnut, and watch as the crowd laughs and claps along. For a moment, it feels almost festive, almost modern, as though the Dark Ages have finally cracked open to let in a little light. Yet the shadows are never far away. At the edge of the crowd, you see a man in ragged robes, his hands shaking as he holds a wooden cross. He shouts about sin and the end of the world, warning that all this laughter and feasting will bring down God's wrath. The crowd jeers, tossing scraps of bread at him, but you notice some villagers glance nervously at the sky, as though half expecting fire to rain down. Historians still argue whether these religious doomsayers were fringe figures or central to medieval life. To you, standing in the crowd, they feel like the background noise of the age, always there, always reminding people of the darkness just beyond the firelight. Later that night, when the music has faded and the stalls are shuttered, you walk through the empty fairground. The air smells of spilled wine, trampled hay, and the faint sweetness of roasted meat. The moon hangs heavy overhead, casting long shadows across the ground. You imagine the fairgrounds in daylight, filled with merchants trading silk, spices, and stories, and realize this was how knowledge began to return to Europe, not from libraries or kings, but from the simple act of buying and selling, of talking and listening. Quirky observation: some medieval fairs had rules against selling counterfeit goods, but enforcement was, let's say, creative. A merchant caught selling fake spices might be forced to eat them in front of the crowd. You picture yourself chewing on a handful of torrons. Sawdust disguised as cinnamon, smiling weakly while everyone laughs, and decide you'll stick to bread and cheese. You find a quiet corner near the edge of the square where a few stray dogs are already licking up spilled stew. You settle against a wooden cart, the boards rough against your back, and close your eyes. The echoes of laughter, music, and haggling swirl in your ears, fading slowly into the night. And as you drift, you realize something. The Dark Ages were never truly silent. They were full of voices, monks whispering over parchment, peasants chanting charms, Vikings singing sagas, and now merchants shouting prices over the clamor of fairs. Knowledge may have been forgotten, but the seeds were still there, carried in scrolls, in stories, even in sacks of saffron and jars of unicorn horn. The night around you feels less like a void and more like soil, rich with seeds waiting to grow. You let your head rest back against the cart, the stars above you shimmering like tiny candles pinned to velvet. Somewhere a bard still hums a tune, soft and low, and you feel the world tilting gently into dreams. The darkness of this age may be deep, but beneath it sparks are gathering, preparing to blaze into morning. And with that thought, you let your eyes close, the festival lights fading to embers as you drift into sleep once more. You stir once again, though now the air is gentler, softer, almost fragrant with the smell of blooming gardens. The road beneath your weary feet is no longer just mud, but edged with cobblestones, carefully laid by hands that seem to remember the craft of Rome. The world feels different now, not fully bright, not yet modern, but humming with a new energy. You can sense it as you wander into a city square where students gather in clusters, parchments tucked under their arms, debating so loudly they forget to notice you drifting among them. A group of young men in robes argue over whether Aristotle was right about the nature of the heavens, while another insists that Plato's cave is a metaphor for sin. Their voices rise and overlap, a lively buzz that reminds you of a crowded cafe. Except instead of laptops and lattes, there are scrolls and clay cups of watered wine. You slip into the back of the group and listen, trying to keep up. It feels like stepping into the middle of a very long lecture, except you didn't get the syllabus and you definitely haven't done the reading. Mainstream historical fact. The 12th and 13th centuries saw the rise of Europe's first universities, in Bologna, Paris, and Oxford. These weren't universities in the modern sense of sprawling campuses with coffee shops and student unions, but guilds of teachers and students, often connected to cathedrals or monasteries. Here, for the first time in centuries, scholars debated openly, studied Aristotle and Plato, many through Arabic translations, and began to systematize knowledge in a way that would eventually fuel the Renaissance. As you wander between the groups of students, you notice something curious. One man is holding up a skull, not as a relic this time, but as a teaching tool. He points to the hollow sockets, explaining how the brain works, or at least how he thinks it works. Quirky tidbit. Medieval medical students often trained by dissecting animals, or occasionally human corpses when they could get them. In some cases, bodies of executed criminals were handed over for study. You can't help but think that this is the medieval version of a YouTube tutorial, except instead of how to bake a cake, it's how to dissect your neighbor, step 1. The air around you hums with debate. One student insists that the Earth is the center of the universe, pointing to Aristotle and Ptolemy. Another counters with new translations from Arabic scholars suggesting the possibility of a heliocentric model, an idea so radical it makes the others laugh nervously. Historians still argue whether medieval universities were truly revolutionary or just repeating old knowledge with new footnotes. But to you, standing in the square surrounded by shouting students, it feels like the first sparks of something larger, like kindling just beginning to smoke before bursting into flame. You wander into a nearby hall where a lecture is underway. A scholar in long robes paces the front of the room, quoting lines of Latin and then translating them into the local tongue. Students sit on benches, scratching notes with quills, some struggling to keep their eyes open. You recognize the look immediately, the universal student face of, "I stayed up too late and now I regret everything." You smile, realizing that even in the dark ages, the struggle against sleep during class was real. The lecture itself is on natural philosophy, what you'd call science today. The scholar explains Aristotle's theory of the 4 elements, earth, water, air, and fire. He insists that everything in the world is made from these elements, balanced in perfect harmony. You know he's not quite right, but you admire the confidence with which he says it. Later, you follow a group of students out into the courtyard, where they cluster under the stars with their books open. One of them holds up an astrolabe, showing the others how to measure the height of the North Star. Another traces constellations in the air with his finger, naming them in Latin: Ursa Major, Orion, Cassiopeia. You look up at the same stars, recognizing them, and think about how these students are rediscovering knowledge you take for granted. A faint smell of bread drifts from a nearby bakery and your stomach growls. You wander toward the scent and find a baker pulling loaves from a clay oven, their crusts crackling in the heat. You buy a piece, this time thankfully no eel filling, and the warmth of it seeps into your hands. A group of students sits nearby, sharing their bread and debating the proper use of logic. One insists that reason must serve faith, another that reason is a gift from God and therefore cannot be opposed to truth. They argue passionately, crumbs flying, and you think, this is the most animated debate over bread and philosophy since your cousin insisted pineapple belongs on pizza. Quirky tidbit: some medieval universities had what were called nations, student groups organized by their region of origin. These groups often fought each other in the streets, sometimes with sticks, sometimes with actual swords. Picture your old college club fair, but instead of a debate over which chess club is cooler, it turns into a full-on medieval brawl with helmets and shields. As the night deepens, you find yourself sitting with a group of scholars in a dimly lit tavern. They pass around cups of wine, still debating whether Aristotle was right about the motion of the stars. One man insists that reason alone can't explain the heavens, while another insists that faith without reason is blind. Their voices rise, hands wave, parchment rustles. Historians still argue whether the universities of the Middle Ages were more about defending church doctrine or about genuinely pursuing knowledge. You, sipping your watered wine, decide that maybe both things can be true at once. Later you wander out into the night. The streets are quiet now, the lanterns guttering low, the air filled with the scent of bread cooling on windowsills. You find a quiet corner near a stone wall, the ground cool and damp beneath you, and sit down. The stars glitter overhead, the same stars you watched from the monk's scriptorium, from the Viking riverbank, from the festival square. Each place you've visited adds another layer to the night, like threads in a tapestry. As you close your eyes, you think about how knowledge has traveled, copied in monasteries, sung in sagas, carried in spice caravans, and now debated in lecture halls. The Dark Ages may have been dim, but here in these universities, in these lively debates and candlelit halls, you can feel the light gathering, waiting to burst into something brighter. You sigh, heavy with bread and stories, and let yourself sink into the soft earth. The night hums around you, steady and soothing, carrying you deeper into dreams where knights argue with monks, poets wrestle with dragons, and somewhere in the distance, a new dawn waits to break.